This is part 2 of the emergence of Latin American democracy. Well, if by the early 80s it was inevitable that democracy would take in Latin America, the big question was, what form would it take? Some people said, look, let's just go to the status quo ante. Let's go back to civilian rule the way it was before the dictatorships. Others said there need to be commissions. We have to have the military pay for their sins. And still others said, look, whatever happens, we can't say that we have a real democracy unless we're embracing the democratic vision of the new social movements. And that's what wins out in Brazil largely, and to some extent elsewhere. But there were also big questions about, what kind of government are we going to have? We're going to have presidentialism? We're going to have a parliamentary system? Now, this third one you might think is silly, but there were people in Brazil who said, hey, let's bring back the monarchy. How about a constitutional monarchy? There were descendants of the old Portuguese crown available. And everything was on the table. People debated everything from child rearing and psychotherapy, and saying, how do we create a democratic ethos in people? Artistic expression was all about, democracy. You saw this in the telenovelas, the soap operas at night. Everything was about how are we going to be a democracy and how will we avoid the mistake of another dictatorship. And if you compare Argentina and Brazil, you can really see how things worked out in two very different tendencies. In Brazil, the dictatorship, as I've said several times, while violent and committing many atrocities, was much less violent than the dictatorships of Argentina and Chile. And with less violence or less state terror, the new social movements had more space and time to develop and to come up with, kind of a platform. Moreover, the military itself was interested in leaving power, and it tried to engineer its leaving in the mid to late 1970s by beginning this opening, or the abertura. And that allowed the new social movements to fill the spaces created by this opening, and political parties to, there was an opposition party to kind of grow and to express itself. So there's more civil society available as Brazil is making its turn towards democracy. Argentina was different. When the military took over in the mid-1970s, Argentina really was at war with itself. There were a left and a right, and they hated each other, and there were radical guerrillas who were murdering people, and certainly the military murdered a ton of people. The military responded with what's known as the Dirty War, with truly horrific levels of violence. I mentioned this before, that we have this thing called the disappeared. And, to have the term to be disappeared comes from Argentina. It's a horrible, horrible notion that someone walking down the street or at work or at school or in their home is just snatched by the dictatorship and tortured and killed. And later, massive graves were found in the ocean of people dumped out of helicopters with cinder blocks on them. There were truth commissions, and the level of violence was horrific. But back to Brazil, what we had in Brazil was a transition that was long and deliberate. It began in the mid-1970s, and it ended. The military left power in 1985, and this allowed a sense of politics and citizenship to develop. It also, because the military had set the structure of how it was going to leave, did not threaten the military institutionally. There were a lot of people that called for trials and so forth, and there were some, but there were very few. There was sort of an implicit deal that if the military left peacefully, then the military wouldn't be held responsible for some of its crimes. And it is ironic that with all of the grassroots activity, with all this new social movements, we don't have radical change in Brazil. We have a desire to have an electoral system and to, at least on the surface, to seem very placid, to have a presidential system with two houses of Congress, structurally to look a lot like the United States. But Brazil's democracy, did have openings for more radical change. It's not a two-party system. It started that way, but the Workers' Party and others made it look a little bit more like Chile's old Congress, where there were more parties representing more people. And the rise of the Workers' Party is an obvious example of this. And you can even see it in economic policy making, that there was a very important economic policy plan called the Plano Real that was put in effect in 1994 and 1995. And it was to get rid of inflation. But what was interesting is that this kind of classic economic shock therapy to bring down inflation also had specific programs to protect the weakest people in society. And that's new. That never would have happened before in Latin America, whether it's a civilian government or a military government. But now that this is a democracy and that poor people and others are mobilized politically, that economic policy making has to pay attention to the needs of everyone. And so you can see that it's not just in who's getting elected to Congress, but it's what they're doing, and what politicians of all parties are doing, that they can't turn a blind eye to the needs of the majority. And that's, I think, a real innovation of the new social movements. But Argentina's democracy was much more fragile than Brazil's. The military had not planned to leave. The military thought it was going to stay, and it was facing more and more opposition from groups like the Mothers and others. And the military worried about its popularity. And so they decided to invade some islands way off their coast that have been controlled by Great Britain forever. Argentina has never controlled them. But they're closer to Argentina than they are to Britain. And Argentina's law may claim to them. This is the Falkland Islands, if you talk to someone from Britain, or the Malvinas, Las Islas Malvinas. They did this in 1982, and the war was planned to divert attention from all of the opposition. But the war was an utter disaster, and the Argentines lost horribly. And this completely undermined the authority and legitimacy of the military, because what people in Argentina said, look, you're quite terrible at running the country, you're torturing people, you're doing all these things, and you can't even fight a war well. So the military was forced to leave rather quickly. And in October of 1982, a human rights lawyer named Raul Alfonsín became the president. Now, he was a vocal critic of the military. He very quickly set up commissions to study the dirty war and to have, and generals were sent to jail, colonels were sent to jail. But here's the problem. Political, and that's good, right? That people were held accountable. And you can say that's better than in Brazil. But by leaving so quickly without a plan, politics very quickly just revert to their old style. Now it's at the top of the slide and it's at the bottom of the slide. Alfonsín comes from the Radical Party, the UCR, right? That's the same party that ran Argentina from 1916 to 1930 and was in politics in various forms in different years. It's an old party. It's a cousin of the party in Chile, the Radical Party that was tied up with the Popular Front and the Unidad Popular. So we don't have new political parties. In Brazil, there are all new political parties. In Argentina, the quickness, the suddenness of the change did not allow for new institutions to come up. And that's one of the reasons that Argentine democracy, while it's there, and the last few presidents of Argentina have all been Peronists, Argentine democracy is not as robust, you could argue, as Brazil's because of the way the transition took place. It was abrupt. In Brazil, it was slow and deliberate. But the big question, I think, going forward is democracy healthy in Latin America? In other words, is this just a phase? Are we looking down the road at more military dictatorships? And, historians are, as a friend of mine likes to say, prophets of the past. I mean, we can't predict the future. We can only talk about the past. But in talking about the present, which I can do a little bit, I will say that democracy in Latin America is fairly healthy and that they grew out of dictatorships. And I think this really matters. I think that in Latin America, because beginning with independence in the 1820s, there were not narratives of democracy, the way you had in the United States and elsewhere, that participating in the struggle for independence meant that you were going to get citizenship rights. So if you were a Minuteman, fighting in the colonial army, you got political rights, right? I mean, white men with property got rights after independence in the United States, and then more and more people got access to those rights. But what happened in Latin America is that the dictatorships, in a weird way, presented the ability to craft a narrative of what democracy meant. What is democracy? It's the opposite of the dictatorship, right? That we know what freedom is. It's what we didn't have in the dictatorship. And so that really, in a bizarre way, ended up helping, particularly in Brazil, Latin Americans craft important ideas about how a democracy should work. But the big challenge going forward is, how do you keep the power and the newness, the freshness of the grassroots movements as they become institutionalized? Brazil's, had, several presidents from the PT. Now, so far they've been successful, but there's a world of difference between being the president of the country and being a labor leader or an opposition leader. And so the question going forward is, will they keep that, that tie to popular ideas and the belief in social justice to keep their democracies fresh? Now, that's a big question. I can't answer that. But what I can say is that for the first time in this region's independent history since the 1820s, the vast majority, I mean, almost all Latin Americans live under, fairly robust, open democracies. And that's certainly a good thing.